Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody that's here. One of the things that I always like to know is who's in the audience. So I just want, out of interest, how many of you are members of the public in general? How many are occupational therapists? How many are health professionals from a different discipline? Students? Okay, great. I am going to start this lecture by telling you a little bit about myself. So I think when we are doing work around justice and inclusion, it's really important that we know who we're talking to and that we are open and able to share something about ourselves. So in thinking about who am I do have to think about what parts of my life am I showcasing today. But first of all, I'm a teacher. So I'm an associate professor in the Division of Occupational Therapy at Stellenbosch University, which is near Cape Town in South Africa. I've got a picture here of Sia, who's one of our occupational therapy students. Our faculty is celebrating its 70th year this year. And they've produced a series of these beautiful posters with our students on to showcase who is in our faculty and what we do. And I really like this caption here about legacy through impact. Because one of the things that's really important in my university is making an impact and addressing health equity and inequity within our society. What is also, I think, important to say about Stellenbosch University is that this was a historically Afrikaans white institution that was the intellectual home of the apartheid government. So all of our apartheid prime ministers trained at Stellenbosch University. The money that was used to grow the university came from the apartheid structures. The intention in setting up the university was to make a higher education institution where Afrikaans white people could go and gain higher education. So it comes with a very particular political background and a legacy that we are together trying to address through our actions. But it also influences the way in which we interact with the community. Because when we go into a community, we are not always going in with a particularly good reputation. So we need to always be mindful about who we are in that way. I'm also a writer, so for those of you who have trained in the UK, which is most of you who are occupational therapists here, I'm one of the editors on the current edition of Creek's Occupational Therapy and Mental Health. I'm very proud of this edition because it was the first time that we got authors from the Global South to contribute to this textbook and really expanded the kind of international footprint and reach, I think. But I also do a lot of research, and some of it is with Anita, who she didn't say was my PhD supervisor like 10 years ago. So that's the connection. I'm also a clinical academic. So the picture in the bottom right-hand corner is the corridor in the day hospital at the rehab centre where I work. It is a community called Bishop Lavis, which is on what we call the Cape Flats of Cape Town. I'll come back to Bishop Lavis, but I work there one day a week as an occupational therapist. We see, the majority of people we see are people with stroke, diabetes, lower limb amputations as a result of diabetes, predominantly, work-related injuries or chronic pain, and then I do a tiny little bit of early childhood development screening for children who are experiencing developmental delay. Then I am a sixth-generation SAFA, or South African, and I think this is an important thing to acknowledge in terms of my own identity, is that, you know, people talk about where do you come from, where does your family come from. My family's been in South Africa for so long that I don't really know where we come from anymore, other than to say that I've got some British heritage, some Irish heritage, some German Jewish heritage, but I am South African. But having said that, I was also an immigrant in the UK. So I lived here for 13 years. My husband and I came over when we graduated from university, and I lived in Manchester for 3 years. I worked at Dewsbury Hospital, which is just down the road, and I'm a graduate of this university. So I did my master's here in professional health studies, and I think I graduated in 2006. So I was here kind of 2003 to 2006 time, and then lived in London for 10 years, taught at Brunel University before going back to South Africa with baby number 3. At that point, I was like, okay, I've had enough. I need my mom. So this picture in the middle is from the Easter weekend this year, my family in South Africa, and I am related by blood or marriage to all of those people. My mom's one of 7 children, and there are lots of us all over the world. I'm also a mum to 4 and a wife to 1 person. So my kids are up there. We have a very little holiday cottage at the southernmost tip of Africa called Cape Agulhas, and that picture's from New Year's Day, I think, this year. So that's me. I wanted to talk a little bit, we've already touched on this, about the daily realities of South Africa, because I think it's really important to understand this as a context for what I'm going to talk about today. So South Africa is a country that has the highest income inequality globally. That means that the difference between people who have money and those who don't is the widest in South Africa. 68% of our wealth is owned by 20% of the population. The bottom 40% of people own 7% of the wealth. We have about 69 million South African citizens and a very large community of immigrants, illegal and legal, from across Africa and from other countries. The country has a very high unemployment rate, so our unemployment sits at between 30 and 40%. We have premature deindustrialization, and the structural impact of apartheid remains. So I need to start it off talking about the apartheid legacy that we come with. And one of the things that the apartheid government was very good at was keeping people separate from each other. So the designated areas or suburbs in which you lived were classified according to your race group, that the government also classified you according to. And movement between those suburbs is largely determined now by economics. So people who have the opportunity to move into a better, usually historically white neighborhood do so, but many of our people are still stuck in townships and informal settlements that were built purposely far from the city center, far from job opportunities, to keep people on the other side. And we still deal with that now. In terms of people with disabilities and older people, we are one of the few African countries that have a grants structure. The SASSA grant is the old age pension grant. It's about £100 a month. And that's it. There's no housing support, there's no health support, there's no vouchers for anything. That is the support. But that £100 a month often will support a whole family of 10 to 20 people. Bishop Lavis, where my rehabilitation centre is situated, is a suburb that is about 20 minutes out of the city centre of Cape Town. We call it the Cape Flats because if you imagine Cape Town, there's a big mountain, and then beyond the mountain it gets very flat, and it's sandy, nothing grows in the soil, it's very dry, it's windswept. The Cape Flats are not great. But this was the site where our apartheid government forcibly removed people who were living in the city centre in the 1940s to the 1960s because they wanted to keep the city centre, which is very nice, as an exclusively white zone. So many of the older people that I work with in Bishop Lavis have personal experience of this forced removal, of being taken out of their homes and moved to the suburb far away that they didn't want to go to. The neighbourhood has about 26,000 residents of mixed ethnicity, predominantly Afrikaans speaking. And as with many places in South Africa, we have very high levels of unemployment in Bishop Lavis, very high levels of crime, drug and alcohol abuse, and we've got a really big problem with gangsterism. So just as an example, I think in the last term of last year, the hospital was locked down 3 times because we had gunshot victims coming into the hospital. And so the security measures get put in place and you cannot leave your rehab unit until everything has been settled down. Having said that, South Africa is a place that is really rich in culture, it's rich in opportunities, the people are amazing, we have a great time. So on the one hand, we have all of this that all sounds very negative, and on the other hand, we actually live a very good life there. So in the lecture today, I want you to walk away with 3 things. The first is the injustice gap. So we're going to talk about occupational injustice and its relationship to health inequity. I want to talk to you about Afrocentric frameworks. So in Africa, what we are thinking about in terms of clinical practice and education that is rooted in our own African philosophies and ways of being. And then I also want to just briefly talk about how we put theory into practice, so promoting participation and well-being among older people in underserved communities, and I will talk particularly about Bishop Lavis. So to start off, well, not to start off, but I want us to think about occupational justice first. So I'd like you to turn to the person next to you, or people next to you, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to tell them what is an activity or occupation that has meaning and purpose for you, and how does it support your health and well-being? I love getting people to answer that question. Don't you see how that energy in the room just changes as soon as you ask people, what do you love to do? How does it support your health and well-being? So this picture here is the picture of the outdoor swimming pool where I do some of my swimming training. One of the things I love doing is swimming. I love swimming in the pool, I love swimming in the sea, I love swimming everywhere. I'm apparently not the only person that loves swimming. So my love of swimming and its health benefits are also evidently shared by other people. So Catherine Arnott and Hannah Spring from this university. Oh, there you are. Oh, there you go. Hi, Hannah. There we go. Cool. Okay, so they published a paper on Lido swimming. It's just that little slice of life for you, the meaning of outdoor swimming in Lidos and occupational perspective. I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but I think one of the things that I want us to connect with is if you think about that thing that gives you joy, that promotes your health and well-being that you were talking about now, do you have the right to participate in that activity? Are you entitled to it? Or on the other hand, would it be an injustice if you were prevented from doing it? Okay. One of the quotes that really stood out for me in that paper was, I could get quite emotional to think of having closed slapped on it, as in on the gate of the Lido. Okay. So in this country, there are very many swimming pools that have been closed over the past 15 years. Access to spaces for health and well-being are on one hand restricted, but are also talked about in government documents as being really important and a priority. Okay? But I think what I'm trying to highlight here is that having that activity taken away is an injustice, and that it being taken away can happen because of forces that are outside of your control. So occupational justice is this idea that we do have a right to participate in a diverse range of meaningful occupations that meet our needs and enable us to achieve our potential as people. The World Federation of Occupational Therapists' 2019 position statement on human rights emphasizes that when choosing occupations, people should be able to do so without pressure, force, coercion, or threat, and that we shouldn't experience risk to our safety, our human dignity, or equity when we participate in this range of meaningful occupations. So according to WFOT, a just and inclusive society protects people's rights to choice, equitable opportunity, meaningful participation, and balance. So having an occupational justice perspective in your practice means that you recognize that each person has different needs, wishes, and habits, and that people need different opportunities to use their talents and to flourish. And one of our jobs as occupational therapists is to support people to find those opportunities and to flourish and grow. There are a number of forms of injustice. So when people don't experience the right to participate in the meaningful activities. I'm not going to go through all of them because there are many. But some of the ones, or some of the original ones that were talked about in the literature were occupational alienation, deprivation, occupational imbalance, and occupational marginalization. We're also now recognizing in the literature that there are other forms of occupational injustice, like imposed occupation, occupational apartheid, and some others. So this literature is now expanding, but there is a recognition for a long time now in the occupational therapy literature that taking away a person's right to participate is a form of injustice. This framework by Stadnik has been updated by Lewis and Lemieux in 2020, and what it shows is that there are various factors that can lead to a person experiencing occupational justice or experiencing occupational injustice. So I think what's really important is that these factors can lead to both experiences of justice or injustice. If we think about my swimming, there are a number of contextual factors, which are actually factors related to the person, that may influence my swimming. Okay? So if I am aged over 60, I might have access to other swimming slots at my local swimming pool for seniors, or I might have a reduction in the price or free access. In terms of my ability or disability, the swimming pool facilities may be accessible. The one at Sea Point where I swim has got very steep stairs, but you can access it with a wheelchair if you go all the way down the road, and I mean like 200-300 meters down the road, and go through the back entrance. Okay? But there isn't any lift or facility to lower people in and out of the pool if that's what they need. So that could impact on me. My income or wealth. So at the moment, I mean, I really love swimming. Swimming in London is costing me £6.50 a session at the swimming pool in London, which is a lot of money, especially if you're coming from a low income or low and middle income country. Social supports and networks. So I swim at home. I swim at 6:30 to 6:45 in the morning, which is school getting ready time. I could not participate in my occupation without my husband doing the school runs in the morning. So social support is really important for me to maintain my participation. But there are a number of other structural factors, or these are things outside me as a person that can also impact on my ability to swim, like health and community supports, employment, transportation. We have very limited public transportation facilities in Cape Town. The quality of the recreational facilities. So that swimming pool that I showed you is a public swimming pool. It's run by the government. It's really well maintained. It's beautiful. That's not the case in places like Bishop Lavis. Technology use is another one. So this morning we had a World Cafe here with older people from a range of different communities to talk about aging in a digital world. If I want to go swimming here in the UK, I have to book my swimming slots on my phone on an app that didn't work when I first downloaded it. So that can also restrict my access. But coming from the global literature, what we're also seeing is that there are a number of other structural factors that are being recognized in the literature, which I think are really important. So things like access to clean water and sanitation. We completely take that for granted, that we can turn the tap and there'll be water coming out. But the majority of people in rural Africa do not have a tap within 300 meters of their house. And if they do, they have to pay for the water from that tap. So it is better to walk to the local river to go and fetch water on a daily basis. The manual handling of that water exceeds the regulations in the UK for manual handling. So the lifting, the bending, the lifting, the carrying it home. Your caste as an Indian national is something that's been highlighted in the Journal of Occupational Science, Health and Wellbeing Journal recently, as something that impacts on people's participation in India. So I think as we are starting to think about these structural and contextual factors, we need to start thinking critically about within our own context. We've got these kinds of frameworks that we can start using to think about what are the things that are impacting on practice. But we need to think about what are the unique contexts in the places that we live that need to be added to this. I think the other thing I want to say about this framework is that as occupational therapists, I think we are very comfortable working with our service users on the contextual factors that limit participation. Those are all things that I can very easily talk to my service users about. The structural factors are much more difficult. And so when we start talking about advocacy in occupational therapy, what I think we should be talking about is how do we address the structural factors that limit people's participation in the things that are meaningful to them. In this slide, I just wanted to highlight that, so one of my colleagues has recently completed a scoping review that maps occupational science literature from low and middle income countries. And what that scoping review has shown us is that across low and middle income countries, the occupational science literature initially was talking about survival and resistance, then about justice and balance, and more recently a structural critique and thoughts about how do we decolonize our practice. So this is important when we come through to thinking about Afrocentric frameworks for practice, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay. So we've had a think now about structural and contextual factors and what occupational justice is. So how do we link this to health equity? I'm sure that many of you in the audience have seen this really beautiful diagram from Angus Maguire at the Interaction Institute for Social Change. And I think it really illustrates beautifully for me what the difference is between equality and equity and what equity might look like. So health equity is the principle that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to attain their highest level of health. It requires actively removing systemic barriers, which I've just talked about, things like poverty, racism, lack of access to care, and all of those structural factors, I think, that was highlighted in Stadnick's framework. And providing tailored resources to address individual and community needs. So some of the key concepts that we need to think about when we're looking at health equity is, first of all, equality versus equity. So equality means giving everyone exactly the same resources. Equity is different. Equity is giving people what they specifically need to achieve the same outcome. So as we see in this picture, if there are only 3 boxes and you need to share them, you can either share them equally or you can share them equitably. So this is really important when we're thinking about under-resourced healthcare systems or healthcare systems that are really under strain. How do we use the resources that we have to achieve equity? Because we can't necessarily, sharing them equally is not necessarily the answer. Health disparities are the measurable, observable differences in health outcomes between different population groups. So, for example, we know that in marginalized communities there are higher disease rates. We know that in people with HIV/AIDS, the rate of aging is faster. There are a number of other groups who are also experiencing marginalization. So the goal of health equity is to eliminate these disparities or these differences between different groups of people. But health is heavily influenced by the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. So health equity doesn't only target the disease or the illness that the person is experiencing, it also looks at the root causes and how we address these. So why this is important for occupational therapy is if we believe that the activities or the occupations we participate in are directly related to our health, then our job is to address the underlying factors that prevent people's participation so that they can be healthier. Okay. So when we think about healthy aging, we need to think, well, the UN Decade of Healthy Aging has highlighted that we need to think about healthy aging in terms of changing the way we think about aging and older people, creating age-friendly environments, the alignment of health systems to the needs of older people, and developing systems for long-term care. So if we think about this creation of age-friendly environments and how we think about aging, I just want to briefly highlight how occupational participation looks different in different contexts. And this slide for me, I think, really illustrates it. So the World Health Organization tells us that healthy aging is being, hang on that slide, having the functional capacity for well-being in later life. Okay? Having the functional capacity for well-being, as in being able to participate. And the things that they highlight as you needing the functional capacity for are meeting your basic needs, learning, growing, and making decisions, being mobile, building and maintaining relationships, and making a contribution to society. All of these are very familiar to the people in the room who are occupational therapists. In Africa, functional capacity can look very different to what functional capacity looks like in other places. So, for example, if we think about meeting basic needs, many of us know what IADLs and ADLs are. So basic activities of daily living, the things that you need to do to look after your body and your basic healthcare needs. Instrumental activities of daily living, those things you need to do to make your self function in your home, I think, and maybe going out into the community. In a rural African context, meeting basic needs means doing things like collecting water and fuel for your fire, so going to fetch your own wood and sticks, subsistence farming without a hose pipe, tending animals, regulating your temperature. So we all know we've had this heat wave over the last few days. It's been very hot. But that if that is your daily reality, how do you stay cool when you don't have access to water and electricity? Being mobile also looks different. So in Africa, our older people need to travel very long distances to move between places. And there are many environmental barriers that they need to cross, or overcome. So for example, crossing a river, because that is the easiest way to reach the local town, rather than taking the road that goes all the way around to the bridge. Okay? Roads that are poorly maintained or have very poor signage on them, with cars that drive very fast and don't necessarily stop for pedestrians. You might need to fight your way through vegetation to get from A to B. Contributing to society is also something that looks a bit different. So in Africa, older people are largely responsible for childcare. So many people who move for economic migration reasons will leave their children with the older parents in their village, and the older people will look after the children. And then I also talked about the old age pension that often supports many families at the same time. Okay, so how do we address these challenges and maintain justice in a context that is so occupationally different to what is necessarily experienced in the United Kingdom? So I want to introduce to you the concept of Ubuntu. which is an African philosophy that is prominent across the continent as a way of living and being. So here I've got a phrase that represents Ubuntu written in isiZulu, but there are examples in many of the other languages. So this reads as Umtu Gumtu Gabantu. And what this means is I am who I am because of other people. Or I am because we are. Okay? So what's really important within this philosophy is that the I and the we are inextricably linked to each other. I do not exist independent of we, and we does not exist without me being in it. So our great Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, or summed it up as, my humanity is caught up in your humanity, and when your humanity is enhanced, whether I like it or not, my humanity is enhanced. Likewise, when you are dehumanized, inexorably, I am dehumanized as well. So when we look at Ubuntu in practice, we need to think about what does this look like? So it's about approaching, if we think about person-centered care, I think Ubuntu links quite nicely, except that it's not person-centered care, it's community-centered care or the collective-centered care. But approaching what we are doing with dignity, respect, empathy, and collective responsibility for each other. So it's not about saying that older people are separate to the society, or that people with disabilities are separate to the society, or that mothers who are trying to look after their children are separate to the society. We are all one group together that have a collective responsibility to look after each other. So we're aiming for interdependence rather than independence. Okay? Because you're not aiming to just be able to look after yourself and meet your own needs. We are aiming to being able to look after ourselves and each other at the same time. This requires compassion, reciprocity, and mutual responsibility, and is something that we can only achieve if we start co-creating services through dialogue and consensus, if we work intergenerationally, and we develop care webs that mobilize the services that are available in the clinic, volunteer networks, faith communities, and neighborhood circles to all share responsibility for a community's well-being. The last thing I want to say about Ubuntu is just to compare it a little bit to collectivism, which has been quite prominent in the occupational therapy literature. So collectivism is a political and social system that prioritizes the group over the individual, whereas Ubuntu is centered on the sense of interconnectedness, that I can't exist without you being there, and a shared dignity. While collectivism sees individual identity as often secondary to the group goals, so I must step back as an individual if it means that we can all achieve the goal better together, Ubuntu recognizes an individual identity that is enriched through the community. And then the value in collectivism is measured by conformity and contributing to the collective goal, whereas in Ubuntu, the value is measured by unique character, empathy, and respect for others. So they're quite different philosophies, and I think it's important that we don't get them mixed up. Okay, so in my last few minutes, I'm just going to talk about one example of how we have put theory into practice. So Ubuntu, occupational justice, healthy aging, how do we wrap these all together in a community that is underserved and has many difficulties? So I've been running a project in Bishop Lavis in a social housing development for older people that promotes social participation and occupational justice. So what is important about this project is, and it comes to the title of the talk being from education, in the flyer, we talked about education and practice sitting side by side. So this was a service learning site for occupational therapy students. Okay? I am the clinician at that site, and for the best comparison I can say is that this is like what you would call a role emerging placement, except that our university runs 8 of these across different sites and different types of services. So it's not role emerging, it is the role, actually. So this is a picture of Hazer Lane. So at the time of the project, there were 45 older people living in this housing development. Each person has a single room that is big enough to fit a double bed, a cupboard, and it has a sink. It's got one plug point, a light, and a basin in the room. And then there are shared kitchen and bathroom facilities and a shared lounge. This is the courtyard that is also then shared by the tenants, they call themselves. They are all independent living community or independent community living older people. There are no healthcare services that come into Hazer Lane. So the way our service learning project is structured is that we have 4 6-week placements that happen over the course of the academic year. A team of students are allocated to the project for the whole year, but one student leads the project for each of the 6 weeks. Okay? So in the first 6 weeks, phase 1, the student leading is responsible for doing a situational analysis. So this is about working with the community to identify what are their needs and what is most important to you. Okay? So the older people or the tenants in Hazer Lane, they helped to prioritize, or they did actually prioritize the needs in their community. The student in the second 6 weeks in phase 2 then plans something that will address the needs of the tenants and gets everything ready for it. The human resources, the equipment, the whatever needs to be organized. Okay? Then in the third 6 weeks, there's an implementation phase where the next student is now responsible for putting this plan into action. And then in the fourth 6 weeks, the student is responsible for evaluating the impact and the outcomes of that project. Now, we run these projects in one place over many years. So what actually happens in practice is, the first year that you set it up, you follow this very well. And then from there are existing things that are happening that the students need to keep running while identifying on an annual basis, are there new needs emerging? Is what we are doing continuing to meet all of those needs, or are there other things that we need to put in place? So within this community, the prioritized needs were managing their health, conflict between the tenants, physical fitness, social participation, and safety and security. So over the course of 3 years of this project, we implemented a social calendar, which was activities on a Thursday like table games, bingo, arts and crafts, theme days. So the picture before was a back to school theme day. Braais, which is a South African barbecue, very popular, very important in our culture. Wellness Wednesday was a physical fitness activity. We had a volunteer from the rehab center come in to run an exercise group. The local health promotion nurse came in to do healthcare talks around things like diabetes management, healthy eating, mental health. But the conflict that I talked about before and that the tenants had prioritized, we really struggled with that. And what we realized was that we actually needed some mental health support within the home as well. So in the third year, we had an NGO that did trauma counseling that came in to work with the tenants on Wellness Wednesdays as well. Then individual rehab. So we had third year occupational therapy students. So our program is 4 years, who then provided individual rehab in people's homes rather than needing to go to the local rehab center. And we did a lot of advocacy around housing security. We had some safeguarding issues. We had issues with the place being broken into, so we needed to address that as well. So over the course of the 3 years of this project, we had 138 individual, I want to call them patient contacts, but that's not the right word, but service user contacts. We ran 76 groups, and we had, 138 individual sessions, 76 groups, and 971 service user contacts, with an occupational therapist who was only working there 1 day a week. That's me, okay? And the students. So I think what I want to highlight with this is that this progressive system has worked incredibly well and provides really good opportunities for proper collaborative working with the community, using the resources that are already in the community to address local needs and achieve the outcomes that are important to that community. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about occupational justice and how it relates to health inequity. I've introduced to you Ubuntu as one Afrocentric framework that can inform clinical practice in education. And we've talked a little bit about how we've promoted participation and well-being among older adults in the Bishop Lavis community. So thank you very much, and we have 10 minutes for questions.
Why do you think your project, that's not disrespectful, but why do you think it's been so successful? What are the key ingredients that you put into the mix of bowl that got such fantastic results?
So I think the number one key ingredient was a true collaborative approach and a very deep commitment to teamwork with the tenants. The students really struggled with that, to be honest. When one of the things that the students have to talk about is the team members in their presentations that they do. And they always started off with the team being me and the other occupational therapy students. And then over the course of 6 weeks, you had to be like, no, but your team is all of the tenants here and the staff at the rehab services and all of the, your team is much broader. So I think consistently coming back to that commitment to collaborative working, to listening, to doing what the tenants wanted, I think was the most important thing. That and relationship building. So we did have a little bit of a tough time in the beginning. I mean, I talked to you about the history of Bishop Lavis, and one of the things that a tenant said to me, I think at the end of the first year, was I never thought that people from Stellenbosch University would be so nice. And that was really hard to hear, actually, because it made me realize, how much of a legacy we were coming in with. And it meant that we really needed to think of our positionality within that community, the positions of power that we were coming in with, but also how we shared that for collective good. Yes.
So you talked about sort of those contextual factors of occupational. Would you say that what you've done within that setting helps to influence those wide things that any work done on those wide sort of outside that setting? Would you say there's any work done there as well?
So I'm just going to go back to that slide of the contextual factors. Sorry. Okay. So if I look at the structural factors, in terms of health and community supports, one of the things that the project did was improve access for those tenants to rehab services, because we could do direct referrals from people within the home into the rehab centre. They still got screened and prioritized alongside all other referrals, but at least we were getting people's names on the books, because most of these people would not have their health and rehab needs wouldn't have even been highlighted if we hadn't been there. So I think that was a really important one. Housing was a very critical one, and one of the slides I missed because I ran out of time was that in the second year of this project, the whole housing development was put up for sale by auction without telling any of the tenants. And they found it on the internet, the advert for the auction. And I was in Canada at the time, and I got this panicky WhatsApp from the house mother, the tenant who was in charge of all the other tenants, to say she didn't know what to do because everybody was in a complete flat spin because they didn't know what was going to happen. And there were older people who had been living there for a very long time. So in terms of advocacy, number one was the first thing I did was to go and read the auction contract. And I could see from reading the auction contract, or the sale contract, in the auction documents, that the tenancy agreements that were existing had to be honoured by the next owner. Okay? So that was already like a win for me. I also contacted the head of the organisation that owned the building. And I will be honest, and I said I used my professor power. And I said, I am the professor who is leading the project from Stellenbosch University that you invited us into your space to come and do, and now you've put this house up for auction. What the hell is going on? And I got a response. Okay? So it also meant that I could use my influence to find out what the processes were. In the end, the house was auctioned off because the organisation that was running it, they couldn't afford to keep the house running anymore. But the new owners have actually been really fantastic, and they have improved the living conditions of the older people that are there. So I think that for me was a really important one. And then in terms of recreational facilities, I think the other thing to say is that the social calendar really opened up new opportunities for recreation. So these older people had never played bingo before, and I can tell you it's so popular, it was great. We have our own unique Bishop Laver style of bingo. It's not quite the same as here, but they love bingo. But what was really interesting about the social calendar especially was thinking about this idea of choice. Okay? The students used to get very frustrated about the fact that not all of the tenants came to the social calendar events, even though most people were home and in their rooms. And I said to them, the thing that's really important in this context is, yes, we have collaborated with the tenants to identify what activities they want to do. We have set up the social calendar in collaboration with them to think about what activities fit best. When is SASSA, the Old Age Pension Grant Day, because then people have a little bit more money for something like a braai versus, the end of the month when there's very little available. But what I said to the students is that in this setting, people experience very little choice in their daily life. There are lots of things you have to do, and it's you looking after your basic needs. And one of the things that you can choose to do is not come. And we have to honour that choice as well. So I think, that was an interesting reflection for me on the importance of choice. And if we're talking about justice, sometimes the choice is to say, no, thank you, I don't want to be there. Yeah.
You mentioned outcomes there. Were there any specific outcomes that you used other than the
Yeah, so we did do a range of, clinical outcomes. So we did the life space assessment, the World Health Organization's disability assessment schedule in the first year. The second year, we used the Werner de Toy model of creative abilities, creative participation assessment, and the Allen cognitive level screen as well. I think what I can say in general, in terms of those clinical outcomes, I haven't reported them, sort of officially because we don't have ethics to do that. But what we did see was that at a minimum, the majority of the tenants maintained whatever level of function they were on. There were some improvements, particularly in life space. So the life space assessment looks at how much access people have to spaces from their bedroom progressively out into the community. It's a really interesting assessment. So the idea is that as people age, the space in which they live their lives shrinks and progressively gets smaller and smaller until you are restricted to your bed. So one of the things we can measure is not how far do people go, but how many aspects of their life space do they go into and how much difficulty do they have doing that. So I think, I don't know if it was because we were there or if people just got a bit braver, but what we did see in terms of life space was that the tenants got much more proactive about navigating the transport opportunities that were available and leaving Bishop Lavis to go to places like Kalk Bay, which is a historic fishing village in Cape Town. And what they realized was if they bought a pack of bus passes, then they could share them between each other. And then a new train service was introduced in Cape Town, which is beautiful and air-conditioned and safe and clean and everything. And so they managed to figure out how to get from the bus to the train station in the center of the city and then out to Kalk Bay and back. And they could do all of that for like £2.50 for a day trip. So, so it was really interesting to see that they got braver in doing that. And I like to think that part of that was because we were encouraging people to get out and about and problem solving and thinking through what the resources were available. But in terms of the clinical outcomes, we did see some positive impact. There's another question up there.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I think you answered in part, but thank you for the officer. I was wondering if you had seen, you obviously talked about increasing function and that social improvement. I was just wondering if you see any sort of tangible direct links between an improvement in health and well-being from the project, and with the participants having that increased occupational participation.
So I think in terms of health, the individual rehab services that the students provided definitely did improve people's health. And there were some aspects of health that were really interesting to see, like improved management of diabetes was a big one for me. So just because we were there all the time and on a regular basis, you could have those conversations with people about their diabetes medication and figure out that they weren't. One of the things that we see is that people don't take their tablets in the morning if they don't have food to eat, and actually that's when you really do need to take tablets, or that people thought that they didn't need to take their tablets except when they were having cake or something similar. So that kind of patient education was a really good health outcome. And what I will say about diabetes is we have a really big problem at the rehab center at the moment because we've seen a massive increase in lower limb amputations, mostly as a result of uncontrolled diabetes and mostly in people under 60. So we've got people in their 40s who are coming in with a lower limb amp. And it's devastating. It's completely preventable. It's so unnecessary, to the point that we don't have the capacity to see people individually. So we've started a subacute AMP group, which just focuses on stump bandaging, wound care, basic transfers, exercise. So OT and physio are doing that in collaboration. And then we've got a separate group to get people ready, prosthetic ready, if they're able to progress to the next level. So diabetes is now one of my big fanfare things that we're trying to sort out. Okay, last question. Yeah.
I'm interested about choice.
Mm.
In my work with older people, there's a lot of perception that you can't do this yet. And a lot of the activities that people want to do are stopped.
Mm.
Have you basically how you
in training to support people to let people have genuine choice.
Yeah. So maybe I'll be a little bit controversial if I say that life is not worth living if there's not a bit of risk. So I think as an occupational therapist, and I did write about this in Creek's Occupational Therapy and Mental Health, I think as health and social care practitioners, it's really important that we figure out how people can take a little bit of risk. And you know, if that means doing all of the paperwork for a risk assessment, then that's what you've got to do. You know, whatever the structure is within which you are working. Sometimes in my work with older people, what is needed is saying, I will be responsible if something happens. Because it's often the carers that are the most worried that they're going to be blamed. And if I say, well, I'm the person who's responsible, I have done the risk assessment, and I've spoken openly with the person that I'm working with about these are the risks. If, you know, made sure they have the capacity to understand the risk, and then we make a decision together about how can we do this safely. But I think it really is important that we do things that, yeah.
Do you have any equipment because we never tracked that enabling that because that helps in this practice actually. Enabling people to make choices and work correctly.
So I think in South Africa, we are a lot less risk averse than my experience of practice here. And I think maybe that comes with the daily reality that our lives are a little bit risky, actually. And even driving into a community like Bishop Lavis is risky for me. I stand out like a sore thumb. So I don't think the legislation is needed as much, and I think people are a little bit more pragmatic about risk versus reward than maybe they are here. But having said that, risk assessment is something that we do take very seriously, and you know, one of the risk factors that we need to consider in Bishop Lavis in particular is that the students are very noticeable, and so they are not allowed to walk out in the community with service users or tenants. So they couldn't walk with a tenant to the local supermarket, for example, because of the risk to the students, not because of the risk to the tenant or the service user.